Good afternoon. Yes, so the next session is about to start. Just a couple of notes. There will be, we're going to have a little bit of time for Q&A in the end, maybe, but there will, most of it, if you don't have time for the questions, you're going to have time afterwards in the office hours. If you do want to ask your questions, if you have questions during the talk, you can ask on swap card. You can go to the session and you can click on live discussion and go to the questions tab. Not the chat tab, the questions tab, and we're going to try to take some questions from there if you have time. If not, we can take care of that in the office hours. So today we have Timon and Ingvild with us. Timon Renzelmann studies sustainable energy engineering, but he has also been interested in storytelling from an early age, having won a creative writing contest at 11 years old. He also self-published a fantasy book with a friend when he was 18, and in the past year he has done independent research on how he can shape stories so they have a positive impact. Ingvild Syntropia is a Norwegian actress, singer, NGO worker, and freelance researcher working in the intersection between art, philosophy, long-termism, and eco-justice. She has a bachelor's in philosophy and the history of ideas, and a master's in media for development and social change. So let's welcome Timon and Ingvild.
Well, thanks all for coming. We will start with a presentation and see how much time we will have left with questions afterwards. And I'm also happy to have Ingvild for the question. She might be able to answer some practical questions from her experience in storytelling. So yeah, let's get started. So we start with, so we have 3 parts, and we start with a background on what kind of role play stories in our lives, and how can they have a positive or negative influence. We'll have a short interlude in between, and then we go to some ideas on how we can create stories that have a more positive impact. And hopefully we'll have time for questions and some discussion in the end. If not, we'll have the office hours, as already said. So I wonder, what do you think about when you choose a story which you like to attend to? Like, what goes through your mind? What's your interest? And I would say mainly we're interested in our kind of hedonistic joy we get out of the experience, right? Whether it be fun to read that book, to watch that movie, we're interested in how the experience would look like. And we do that quite often, so I don't know, how long did you spend just within the last week attending to some different forms of stories? Maybe you were listening to some kind of narrative or watching some movie, whatever. So we do that quite a lot. We enjoy that. And we could wonder why. Why do we do that? Right? So why do we spend these hours looking at glimmering screens? And when we come from evolutionary psychology, we can find an explanation for why we spend so much time with stories. And the background is that from an evolutionary background, we evolved to use contingent knowledge for our advantage, which is knowledge which is specialized and only true under certain conditions. And that helped us to succeed and navigate different environments which pose different dangers and threats, like environmental dangers or some predators. And it also especially helped us to use this specialized knowledge to navigate social environments, which are very complex and pose many challenges, and to do that somewhat successfully. And the idea is that stories help us acquire this contingent knowledge by delivering us with contextualized information. So we can see stories as some kind of chain or web of linked information, and by engaging with them, we learn from them. And of course, not every story might have an evolutionary benefit, but that's the case for other evolutionary responses too, right? So being scared is sometimes useful, but not always. But the share of when it's useful accounts for the errors. So better to run away from a potential tiger, which turns out to be imagined once too often, than once too little, right? Then it's over. it's similar for stories. Better to attend to one story too much than to miss out of this potential information value, which can help us. What makes stories very special, also in comparison to other forms of arts, is their potential to draw us into their narrative world. Right? So when we engage with stories, we can really dive into them, forget everything around us, and be part of that movie or book in a way. And one framing which is, I think, really useful is to see stories as some kind of simulators. Right? So while the pilot would use a flight simulator to train flying in a safe environment, we as humans use stories as simulators for human experience, which is often social experience. And by doing so, learning how to better succeed as a human in a way. So this is an example for a study which shows how our beliefs are influenced by stories. And the participants of the story, who were students at the Columbia University, read a story about Michael, who decides to drop out of school. And they read one out of two versions of that story. And in one story, the reason for Michael's school dropout was given to be situational. So it was an underfunded urban school, and because of that, Michael decided to drop out. In another version, the reason was given to be dispositional. So Michael himself suffered from teen indecision or angst, and because of that, he decided to drop out. And there was also a control group which read an unrelated story. And also, alternately, the participants were told that the story would come from either a newspaper article or would be from a fictional origin. And after reading that story, the participants were asked what they would think would be general reasons or solutions for this issue of school failure or dropout. And depending on which kind of story they read, they gave different general causes and solutions. So for example, students who read the situational version were twice as likely to give situational causes and potential solutions for tackling school dropout. So they were more likely to say reasons would be too large class sizes or poorly trained teachers, and potential solutions would be something like increasing funding or better training the teachers. And the reason, or the explanation for that given was basically the availability heuristic, which basically means what kind of images come to mind when thinking about this general case of school failure. And that, of course, was influenced by the story they read. And what was also interesting, there was no difference in regard to the framing. So whether they were thinking this story has a true origin or was fictional didn't influence their response to general causes and solutions. And the last thing is also backed up by a lot of other studies which say the influence is not or very littly influenced by whether we see the story to be true or fictional. So we are bad at assessing the truthfulness of the information we get out of the story. So we don't always assign a label to, okay, this information comes from a story which is fictional, and this comes from a story which is from a true origin. And even if we are aware, we are bad at moderating what we learn from the story. Because we learn from stories differently than we learn from arguments. When we engage with stories in this kind of simulation, we update our mental models and we test them, and we see whether they fit. We might update them, or we might, if we are very confident in our mental model, we might come to the conclusion that the story is unrealistic. That can also be the case. But this process is mostly subconscious and hard to interrupt. Right? So you can question yourself, have you ever argued with a story? I don't know, raise your hand if you did. Would be cool. Nice. So using stories is also a potential to influence people who are not very open to arguments. And stories influence much more than just beliefs. They influence attitudes and behaviors. They influence social skills like empathy, compassion, or theory of mind. In connection to that, they influence our capacity to think moralistically. They also influence values and character traits. So I don't know, if we like a character in a story, we might be inclined to copy some of their way of behaving or see them as a role model. And they also can influence whole cultures. And I think this is very well described in this quote, where Georg Gärtner, who is the father of the cultivation theory, basically says, stories socialize us into roles of gender, age, class, vocation, and lifestyle, and offer models of conformity or targets for rebellion. They weave the seamless web of the cultural environment that cultivates most of what we think, what we do, and how we conduct our affairs. So we can see cultures also as being made by different stories. This is one example for how stories can have a bad influence. And this quote was actually the quote leading me to this rabbit hole on looking into how we're influenced by stories. It's actually around 20 years old, I think. So here I quoted the third version of the book. And Marshall Rosenberg said in 75% of the television programs shown during hours when American children are most likely to be watching, the hero either kills people or beats them up, and this violence typically constitutes the climax of the show. So I can't back up the 75% with evidence here. Don't know if it's still true, if it was true, but I think the quote makes a point, right? So it's about the way we display violence in our stories and what impact might that have. And recent research shows that the context of violence matters. So violence in stories is not violence in stories. And aggression-promoting factors are, for instance, if the perpetrators are appealing, or if violence is rewarded, justified, left without consequences, or displayed arousing, like supplemented with some engaging music, for instance. And there's a large body of research which shows the connection between aggression and violence in stories and their influence towards people. And of course, it doesn't mean we should get rid of violence in stories. It does also not mean that violence is never the best available solution. But in my view, often it's used as a hook for the audience's attention and handled with rather little care. And also, to be fair to Spider-Man, in the recent movie, I don't know if you watched it, they changed their motto from, so the three heroes changed their motto from, quote, let's kick some ass to let's cure some ass. And they basically tried to save the villains. So I found that rather cool. Another example, so these are newspaper articles from the refugee crisis in Great Britain, 2015. And I mean, stories somewhat abstract reality and simplify reality, and that makes them also in some way easy to reinforce or introduce stereotypes. Here we basically see narratives about immigrants, which don't really make integration more easy. Yeah, I mean, that's not only the case for newspaper articles, can also be in books when certain groups are linked with certain behavior or character traits, or when certain groups are not represented at all. But recently, this issue has become more attention, if you might have noticed. And stories don't only influence how we see strangers, but they also impact our most intimate relationships, which is shown by this piece of research, where a correlation has been found between reading romantic literature and attitudes towards safe-sex elements like the use of condoms. People reading a lot of this kind of literature where these attitudes were disregarded had more negative attitudes towards using those elements. And the research also showed that including those elements in the story leads to more positive attitudes towards using them. And the second study also found that this pathway of influence also works the other way around. So if you show that not using or not engaging in safe behavior, that this can have bad consequences like unwanted pregnancies, that also increased more willingness to engage in responsible behavior. So it matters how we represent different things in stories. Stories can also do good. So they don't only make our life worse, of course. These are two different studies. In one study, it has been shown that stories can increase willingness to engage in preventive behavior in regard to preventing skin cancer, like sun protection. They can also increase willingness to quit smoking. This was a study which basically presented the participants with a positive example for a character who quitted smoking and that increased intention to quit smoking. Another example is the movie Blackfish. I don't know if you've seen it. It's a documentary, I think from 2013, which shows negative consequences of the marine mammal captivity. Here it was about orca. And the movie had a big impact. It changed people's perception of marine mammal captivity and catalyzed a whole movement against it. It also led to bad publicity for SeaWorld and sale drop. I don't know, probably most of you have seen some kind of documentary of David Attenborough, and I heard many voices saying he had a big impact on them and motivated them to do good in terms of mitigating climate change. A third example, which is often used, is this rather old book, Uncle Tom's Cabin from 1852, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And that book turns around slavery and gives a vivid example of the reality of slavery. And it's been known for changing people's views and attitudes towards slavery. And this quote, which is attributed to President Abraham Lincoln, I don't know if it's ever been spoken, but I think it's a strong quote. So she said, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war," where I think it makes visible how big the impact was this book had in the anti-slavery movement. Of course, it wasn't the only thing which changed people's minds, but it did have a big impact. And following the publishing of the book, of course, the author ran into a lot of criticism. That's not true, slavery is not that bad, and these kind of arguments. And then she wrote a second book in which she collected facts and real-world examples to basically make the case that her book was actually a realistic representation of the reality of slavery. And in that second book, which is called A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, she basically says why stories are so powerful in changing people's minds. And there she says that the atrocious and sacrilegious system of breeding human beings for sale and trading them like a cattle in the market fails to produce the impression on the mind that it ought to produce because it's lost in generalities. It's like the account of a great battle in which we learn in round numbers that 10,000s were killed and wounded and throw the paper away without a thought. So she makes basically the case for having a case, or the identifiable victim, and that having a vivid story can be much more moving and touching than rather sometimes cold numbers or statistics or arguments. So we can't make everyone think perfectly rational. We probably can't even do that ourselves. And even if it's certainly a worthy case to increase rationality, we still need stories. We need stories because they are a way of changing people's minds by experience. They deliver this emotional experience, and exactly. So we still need to rely on stories to some degree. Okay, so now we will have a short interlude. So please look around you and pick one or two people next to you And the question I would like you to discuss would be, is it desirable to optimize stories for having a positive influence? Because we might think, okay, it might somewhat limit the freedom of storytelling or the freedom of art, and maybe there's some key value of the story which is being lost if we try to use them as an instrument for positive change. So yeah, please grab someone and just 2 or 3 minutes talk about that question.
It is a good way of I think this is currently done. I mean, one of Hollywood prices, but creating a positive message, then telling a good story, then the results are just not enjoyable, and the story immediately fails. So, yeah,
there are examples of that, both good story and good trade model.
yes, but I think it's way easier to do it historically in a manner instead of I mean, like, stuff kind of gets sticky. I mean, political correctness is kind of false. And like a lot of stuff, yeah, the story is not quality that things that needs to be brought brings to bark. Yeah, story writing just bad because the message is not important in the story. Yes,
Lord of the Rings?
yeah, the Amazon Lord of the Rings thing. Amazon did a Lord of the Rings show personally being mocked because it was so obvious that if you try to like basically they had Sauron as an undercover character, and the first episode people knew that this character was Sauron because it was super obvious, but
What was the model there?
so I mostly watch a few videos about how the show fucked up politics and so this kind of stuff. But generally like widely gender based on the characters is kind of stuff. I think there's like thought out what that's not easy to enter the story. An example is done right in medicine. It's basically it's not no sexual existence in this world. It's basically no sexism, no gender roles, the empire, the Nalazan empire, the army was corrupted that's a very interesting world. I think Malazan.
So please pause here for now. If you like, you can continue later. Anyone likes to share some ideas? What do you think? Anyone has some idea on this and would like to share something?
I find it hard to listen to this talk and then say no. But I really wanted to, so I came up with a possible no. When the line between fiction and non-fiction gets blurry, maybe you want to stay conservative and just stick to the facts, even when you think that the reader might take a story from it that you wouldn't consider as positive.
Okay, interesting. Some other opinion? Yeah.
I think this is potentially pretty good and can be very effective, but I think it's way easier to mess it up and just focus on your message over telling a good story, and then the story just, well, it's not effective and in delivering the message because you build a flawed vehicle.
I see.
NPCs, so it's also important to keep the story, like the creative process going and keep the story interesting.
Yeah, basically good how
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess also on that note, having a totally clear, like optimized story, a message that's super clear to the audience, can be effective. If it's like attractive enough, but also sometimes arts or stories can be like intentionally not clear, like abstract art. There you go. And so yeah, sometimes abstract art can like force a certain perspective, but it requires a lot more. It asks a lot more of the audience to engage with it, and so I think in that sense it's not optimized. Yeah.
Okay, one more.
I write rational fiction, and my story tries to do this by essentially thinking about what is the thing that the characters can do in this circumstance that's the most effective thing to do in that circumstance, such that the reader reading the story can learn from what the character is doing. And to me, this makes this question just like naturally combine these two answers together, where it's like a good story, in my opinion, is one in which the characters are doing interesting things and like resolving the conflicts in ways that are interesting for the reader to read and like engaging for the reader to read and learn from. And if those things are true and useful, it will be a positive influence to them. And like optimizing for that is, to me, just part of what it means to optimize for writing a good story. So yeah.
I like that. Okay, so let's continue. I wanted to share one short story about the Alpha. So that's a German author, and he writes fantasy books. And in his books, there's this race of dark elves. And what they basically do is they kill other folks, like dwarves or humans, and out of their blood and bones, they create art. Right? So the question would be, would we like such art? And I would say no, we don't. And people who would attend would probably be quickly imprisoned. But the case I wanted to make with this story is, if, like, for some reason you would lean away from trying to do good with your story and just like to be creative or have some other, or want to write a story for self-expression or whatever reason, at least don't cause harm. That would be my request. But yeah, let's keep on going. So from here, it's basically general assumptions I made, and these are not backed up by science, but more the state of hypotheses. But hopefully it makes sense. So the question is, how can we write stories that have a positive impact? And the first thing, which might appear rather obvious, is choose a topic that matters. Right? So the market of stories usually selects for what's interesting rather than what's helpful. And from an evolutionary point of view, we have certain things where we're interested in, which gave us an evolutionary edge, like whatever, violence, dangerous things, love stories, some things which helped us back in the days. But the thing is that evolution doesn't select for well-being, and what helped thousands of years ago also might not be helpful today. So we might have some interests into things which are not that useful for us. And like, for instance, the same with our craving for highly caloric food. We like sugar, and that might be useful if calories are restricted. But today it leads to many people suffering from obesity. Right? So if we want to have a positive impact, we need to think about not only what's interesting, but also what is useful. Yeah, and the second idea is to think very carefully about key-cause relations. Okay, so what do I mean with that? If we go back to the idea of seeing a story as a simulator, we can draw an analogy. So what makes a useful simulation? So if we go back to our pilot who uses a flight simulator to train flying, we can think what makes the flight simulation helpful or useful. And the flight simulation needs to be accurate in representing flying
basically the connections between the controls of the plane and the aerodynamic behavior of it. And if that flying is misrepresented in the story, then the pilot might learn things which might work in the simulator, but not in real life. So she might learn how to react when an engine fails, and then if she would be confronted with this dangerous situation in real life, she might act in the best interest, but might still cause disaster because the flight simulator didn't prepare her for that situation. Right? So in that case, the goal needs to be represented accurately in the simulator. And my first thoughts here were, okay, easy, so just make stories realistic, and then they will do good, right? But of course it's not that easy. Human life is not as straightforward as flying a plane. And we might also want to use exaggerations in order to help people build useful mental models. So here in an analogy, when people train to swim, they sometimes use these hand pedals, which enlarge the surface area, and they basically emphasize the biofeedback of pushing the water away, and by that the swimmer can better learn how to move in the water. So exaggerations can be useful in stories if they highlight or emphasize important connections between action and consequence, or between what leads to well-being, ultimately. But there's a difference between highlighting and exaggerating things in order to make them more visible, and distorting things. Right? So exaggeration can be useful, but not if they are misleading and lead to building mental models which are not useful anymore in the real world. So there's a difference, which I think is important. So here's some questions that might be helpful. If you're like writing a story and want to see, do I accurately represent what matters? So we could ask, okay, what impact does this action have on well-being? And what worldview do I transport? Or how do I represent humans? Are risk and negative consequences represented? Right, so for instance, one way in which a story might be misleading, which I already talked about, could be violence, right? And if someone would learn from a story, okay, in certain situations, silence is the solution, then this solution might work in the story, but might lead to a perpetuate cycle of destruction in the real world, right? So we need to think, do we accurately represent consequences of actions or events? And then if we do that, we can learn from stories in a way which support us in our lives. Okay, another rather obvious thing is we need both positive and negative examples in stories. It's not all about writing fairy tales and shining heroes. So we need some kind of good ideas, maybe some visions, inspirations for how can we do good. But we also need to be made aware of pathways which leads to places we don't want to visit. And warnings can be as useful as good examples. And we also don't need shining heroes. We need realistic, three-dimensional characters which perform like regular decisions. I really like this description of the rational choices. So what matters is what consequences those decisions have, ultimately, in the story. Another question which is often food for debate is, can we accurately represent like the most difficult topics, the darkest chapters of human history, and is it respectful to attempt that? Right? So sometimes critics say, okay, it would be disrespectful towards the victims to tell a story about this, or to make a movie out of this. And other people might say, okay, it's important to remember and to learn in order to prevent this from happening again. Right? And I would wonder, okay, how can we remember without telling stories? So in my view, we would need to address those delicate issues, but of course we need to be careful on how we do that. right? What media do we choose? How do we tell the story? Or who tells the story? And I think it can also be quite entertaining and useful to use moral topics like dilemmas, paradoxes, riddles in stories, and to use stories as for like some kind of scenarios of whatever, some future scenario. And that can be really fun to if you like to think morally, it's really fun to read such a story. And then reading such a moral riddle in a story would maybe look something like this. Okay, so if we chose a topic that matters, and if we're sure we know enough to accurately represent it in our story, there are some ways in which impact can be increased. And this is again backed up by science, but the effect size varied across studies, and the research field is far from being exhausted, so also take this with some skepticism. The first factor is absorption. How much are we in the narrative? So how much do we forget about everything else? How much are we absorbed? And that increases how we are influenced by the story. And absorption itself is impacted by several factors like style or interest into the topic, knowledge relevant to the topic, so maybe some visible benefit. And we are also more absorbed if the story appears to be somewhat realistic, or if it fits into the world of the story. And also situational factors matter. Another factor is our involvement with the characters. Do we like the characters? Are they three-dimensional? Can we identify with them? So we are more likely to take up characteristics from a character which we like than some character which we dislike. So if we create a character which is especially likable, we need to pay more attention towards them not behaving too badly, let's say it that way. And the third factor is called emotional flow. So that's basically defined as the evolution of the emotional experience during the story, which is determined by different emotional shifts. So in other words, are we emotionally engaged? And thinking about how to have a big impact with stories might seem somewhat serious, but humor can also increase emotional flow and is certainly recommended to use in stories. And deep topics can also be fun. I don't know if you know Ricky Gervais, but he has like 2 series on Netflix where he deals with deeper topics in a funny way. So humor can also be used effectively, and also just as it's fun to use it. Here I listed some questions which might be helpful in the writing process. So if we ask a question, could this story be for children? That might make us more sensitive towards the impact of the story, right? So children are more vulnerable towards influence. So if we think what the story might have as an impact to children, we might become aware of some issue or misrepresentation within the story, right? Other questions could be, what could be a reason for a tragedy happening apart from just simple evil, right? So sometimes villains are just being said, okay, the villain is evil and that's it, right? It's not very useful. It's more useful if we see reasons or patterns leading to tragedies or leading to people becoming what we would call evil, because then we can prevent it, we can deal with it, we can work with it, right? And we could also think, why do we like the story? And that might give us some personal insight into some values or personal preferences. So writing a story that has a positive impact is also always a journey for the writer and some process of self-reflection. Okay, coming to the end of the presentation soon. So this is some outlook. How can you help? So first, of course, keep on writing useful stories, or start doing so if you're interested. You can join the EA Fiction Slack channel. If I can distribute the presentation, and I linked everything, also the Slack channel here. I unfortunately don't have a QR code, but if you're interested, you will get access. You can also educate yourself or other people on media literacy. Media literacy means skills on engaging with stories, so that you identify misleading things or have more control over the influence. You can also perform research, especially I think one research field that would be interesting would be quantifying and estimating the potential impact on well-being, which we could have with stories. So I would be super excited to see research on that. And also actively respond to stories that you would think are misleading in a way. Because when we see other people responding to stories, that also influences the impact. So raise your voice if you see something which you don't like. That might also be useful. I end with 2 recommendations. This is a TED Talk by Andrew Stanton, who's a very famous writer and storyteller. He is the mind behind Nemo, for instance, or Toy Story. And his advice on storytelling is use what you know and draw from it. Doesn't always mean plot effect. It means capturing a truth from your experiencing and expressing values you personally feel deep down in your core. I like that talk, so that's recommended. If you're interested in the science behind it, these 2 books are very helpful. And these are some of my references. And thank you for listening and coming. I hope we have some time for questions.
Yeah, so we have 5 minutes, so we have time for a couple of questions. Okay, so the first question. Isn't the point of art, including storytelling, to evoke strong emotions, also sometimes strong negative emotions, in order to make the person reading aware of certain situations and feelings? The best pieces of written art are also controversial art. Wouldn't a world with only positive, realistic examples or positive takeaways be boring and repetitive?
I agree. So I think we need warnings, as I tried to explain. So we need bad examples, we need evoking strong emotions, and controversial art is also very useful. So exploring foggy moral terrains or things where we don't know what's right can also broaden our horizon. So I would definitely agree. I don't think we just need fairy tales. I certainly agree.
Okay, second question. What practical advice would you have for someone who wants to get started with storytelling, other than practice a lot and get feedback?
I would think about what you care about, right? So if you want to write something which is moving, include some value of yours, some draw from your experiencing, right? And what also helps is reading a lot. So, and maybe try to become mindful of why do you like what you read? Yeah, I don't know, that's what I would say.
Okay, another one. Do all the aggression promoting factors need to be present, and can removing a single one, like showing serious consequences, even to justify violence, remove the negative outcomes?
I mean, it's a complex phenomenon. I think it's not that straightforward, and I didn't perform the research myself. I don't want to attempt to try to say, yeah, sure. So I don't know. These are all factors which affect the influence, and what matters in the end is also the individual to some degree. So yeah, I think the less of those factors are present, the better, probably. Yeah.
And finally, how do you suggest for EA to incorporate storytelling and making it more appealing for a broader audience?
That's the $1 million question. Yeah, well, I don't know. I think we just need skilled and interested people in storytelling, which care, and then they need to tell stories. I don't have a strategy. Yeah, sure, help me, please.
So one of the things I've been noticing, which has been kind of fun over the past 10 years or so, I don't know if you guys like watch these YouTube channels like CinemaSins or pitch meetings or things like that. There's a lot of channels out there that are like doing basically the rational fiction thing of pointing out the ways that stories are making mistakes, or characters in stories are not doing the optimal thing, or like it doesn't make any sense for the story to be a certain way. I think this is indicating that there is in fact an appeal for people to read stories that make more sense, for characters that have good motivations, for the stories to like affect things that like can teach things like that are real. I would say that one of the things that I tell people who want to get into storytelling in EA and rational fiction is something like find a story that you think could have been just so much better if they just changed like this one thing or this other idea that you have about it that would have just made it so much better, that's pretty popular, and write fan fiction of that. And it might get really popular and change a lot of people's minds, like Harry Potter and the Methods of Rationality did, and like a lot of other rational fiction does now. I think EA fiction could be similarly inclined towards this. If you haven't read like A Song for Two Voices, this is basically EA fiction of something called the Valdemar series, a fantasy series, and not just rationalists and EA people read it. Yeah.
Thanks. Maybe there's one question for Ingvild. So if you have some question for how acting or theater plays a role, please ask it.
I'll be in the Q&A or no, the office hours afterwards. Yeah. Yeah, feel free to ask me anything relating to working as an artist, trying to do good with art. I'm exploring this space myself, so I'm not expert, but we can maybe find out things together.
Yes, so that's what we had time for. Yes, remember that we have there's office hours now. It's in the room number 11, if you remember correctly. Yes, JF stall room. So yes, thank you.